Welcome to the world of Warcraft. My liege? Yes.
Okay, so there's not a lot of games which can claim a level of sustained popularity which manages to cross the decade boundary, but two such franchises which have such games within them both happen to have been developed by the same company. One of them is Diablo II, but none of the Diablo games ever showed up on DOS, and they're not likely ever going to show up in this series because of that. But the other, World of Warcraft, has its roots right here in today's ancient DOS game, simply known as Warcraft. Or more specifically, Warcraft Orcs and Humans. Now, while I've never played the original Warcraft up to now, I have indeed played and own a copy of the sequel, Warcraft II, which is an extremely well-made real-time strategy game. So I figured going back to the original was basically just going to deliver a more simplified experience compared to the sequel, but it's actually kind of surprising just how big of a jump in quality there is between the original and the sequel, and I think we can blame this entirely on Westwood Studios. So here's the thing. The game which really set the RTS genre in motion was Dune II back in late 1992, and it wouldn't be until 1995 when Westwood would release Command & Conquer, which took all the aspects introduced in Dune II and ran with them to result in a much more polished and playable experience. Warcraft, which was made by Blizzard, came out in 1994, and when you play the original Warcraft, it really does feel like you're playing Dune 2. And when you go to play Warcraft 2, it feels like you're playing a completely different game, despite many of the same mechanics still being present. That's how big of a jump there is in the user experience between the first and second Warcraft games, with the original's mechanics clearly being inspired by Dune 2, and the sequel's mechanics clearly being inspired by Command & Conquer, with the presentation itself being steeped in fantasy as opposed to modern military. And of course, because it's a strategy game, I royally suck at it. Well, I shouldn't say that, because overall I find the difficulty of this first Warcraft game to be not that insurmountable, but I found myself wrestling with some of the mechanics to the point where I'm pretty sure an expert could beat this game's levels 3 or 4 times faster than I was. I mean, the game isn't bad by any stretch, but it has many of the same rough points as found in Dune 2, since that was the gold standard for the genre at the time. Once you know how to deal with those rough points, you can do alright. Warcraft was developed and published by Blizzard Entertainment, being released in the latter half of 1994, and is a 1 to 2 player real-time strategy game. It only supports VGA 320x200 256 color graphics, but a decent array of audio devices for the time. As for its current release state, it's still commercial, and you have a few options for grabbing a copy. Now, if all you want is a quick and simple digital copy to download, then you can either grab it on GOG or on battle.net, either of which cost $6 alone. Though on GOG you can save $1 if you buy both it and Warcraft 2 together as a bundle. Surprisingly, this game is not on Steam, and I'm not entirely certain why that is. Though from what I understand, the Battle.net release is actually extremely recent, as in just a few weeks before making this video, which makes me wonder if the GOG release is going to stick around or not. If you want a physical copy though, this is where things get kinda ridiculous. You see, loose copies of the CD are extremely common and dirt cheap, as I can literally find CDs of this game available online for $1. Yeah, feel free to make a RoboCop joke about that one. The thing is though, that's all for loose copies. The moment you want more than just the CD, the prices skyrocket. The cheapest fully boxed copy I could find was $65, and most others were graded speculator nonsense, priced well into the hundreds or even thousands of dollars. Yes, seriously, 4-digit price figures for a game that's so incredibly common that the CD itself has almost no value. Actually, if you do decide to grab a physical copy, there's a couple things to watch out for. The first is that there's 3 different releases, one which supports both macOS and DOS from the same CD, and 2 earlier releases which only support DOS, one on floppy disks and the other on CD. Thus, if your aim is to have a physical copy which will also work on an old Macintosh computer, make sure it's a disk which explicitly states that the Mac version is on it. Don't just go by what the sellers say, because I came across several sellers claiming to be selling a PC/Mac version, and the photos clearly show a DOS-only disk. The second thing to watch out for, though, is that Blizzard was one of those companies who like to put out cheaper boxed and sealed copies of their games in a shareware format. And sure enough, there are fully boxed shareware copies of this game floating around out there. From what I understand, these copies of the game are only on floppy disks, not a CD, and the box itself should explicitly state shareware under the title, so you can identify what you're getting. But it's just one more thing to be aware of if you're seeking a physical copy.
In the age of chaos, two factions battled for dominance.
There's actually a decent chunk of backstory in the manuals to this game if you want to dig into it all, but there's really not a lot worth going into for sake of understanding what's going on here in the game itself. Basically, you've got a fantasy world with both humans and orcs, both with control over various parts of the land, both hate each other, and both are trying to take over each other's territory. And yes, I said manuals plural. Some copies of the game originally came with two manuals, one intended for humans, the other intended for orcs. And despite this contrast, they're actually very similar to each other, save for the backstories provided and the descriptions of the units in the game. Well, actually, the similarities between the two sides is going to be a running theme as we dive deeper into this. Before you begin playing, you can either choose to play the orc campaign, the human campaign, or start a custom game, which basically lets you choose which side you'll be on, which side the opponent will be on, and can then choose one of the game's maps to do battle on. Each campaign sends you through a dozen missions, which are all more or less equivalent to each other between both campaigns. For instance, the first mission, both campaigns, sets you the task building a base with 6 farms and a barracks. The second mission of both campaigns involves hunting down all enemies in the area. The third mission of both campaigns is your first go at taking out an enemy base. The fourth mission of both campaigns involves tracking down prisoners in caves with no access to a base at all. And yeah, the missions stay pretty equivalent to each other each step of the way, short of the maps themselves being different. Generally speaking though, what you typically end up doing in most missions is building a base and training units to help defend it, with the ultimate goal of annihilating your opponent. Each base always starts off with a town hall, which allows you to train human peasants or orc peons. Peasants and peons are incapable of fighting, rather instead, these are the units which will harvest resources or build almost all of your other structures. The two resources you have to concern yourself with are gold and lumber. Gold comes from gold mines, which are scattered across the map, and lumber comes from the forests, which initially act as obstacles, but as you chop your way through them, you can end up creating paths and clearings. The typical progression of a base is to first start off building one or more farms, keeping in mind every structure you build has to be next to a road tile, with roads being built by your town hall itself. Each farm you have adds 4 to the maximum number of units you can support, which includes your peasants and peons, thus finding a good balance in terms of how many of them to have while still having plenty of food left for other combative units is key to victory. Next, you generally build a barracks, since most units are trained and generated by this structure. There's also a lumber mill, which unlocks the ranged attackers for your side and allows upgrading their attacks, a blacksmith, which allows upgrading melee attacks and the defensive shields for your melee attackers, stables to unlock the horse riding melee attackers for your side, and as you get further in, you'll get even more advanced stuff going, along with magical units and the ability to research and cast a small variety of magical spells. Now, all of that said, these things are all pretty equivalent between the two different sides, but there is a considerable difference in the spells that can be cast. For instance, the first major spell the human clerics get is a healing spell, so you can heal your units. Well, the first major spell the orc necrolytes get allows them to raise the dead, turning a corpse into a skeleton, which won't last long, but gets in that extra bit of damage to help drain your opposition. Okay, so far this game doesn't seem like anything too out of the ordinary, but you'll recall I said this game felt like it was clearly inspired by Dune II. One of the main things this game does, which I find very unusual, is try to encourage defensive play with smaller batches of units. Just like in Dune II, and even Command & Conquer, which came later than this game, stationary units have initiative versus moving units, as a moving unit can't attack, but can be hit by a stationary unit, even if it's just a single pixel of distance into a nearby grid space. As a result of this, an incredibly potent tactic against the AI is to use a single unit to catch the attention of one or more AI units, then goad them back to a skirmishing line you have ready and waiting to take them on. This tactic worked really well in Dune 2, and it works really well here too. At least, against melee units. It's not super bad against ranged units either, but then you're taking away some of the control. as the way it works here is that when any of your stationary units get attacked, they'll alert each other and start to move towards whoever attacked them. Now, if you could focus your attacks better, this wouldn't be too big a problem. But the AI has been designed in a very sneaky way, which directly contrasts how much control the player has. Firstly, the AI makes it a point to attack units with the lowest HP. Now, you can technically do this too, as you can click on any unit or building and see its HP, regardless of whose it is. But this takes you several seconds, whereas instead the AI just instantly knows who to attack to whittle you down as fast as possible. Secondly though, the AI can command an entire army all at once with zero effort. But you as the player not only cannot group units together into selectable groups, but you can only select up to a maximum of 4 units at a time. Yeah, given that your units will only automatically attack enemies if they themselves are attacked, or if a unit directly next to them is attacked, trying to command a full assault against an enemy base often doesn't go well. Not because you're outnumbered, but because the AI can outplay you in an all-out free-for-all. This is why it's so important to try and pick off the enemy units only a handful at a time, because if you get into an all-out fight, you are very likely going to lose it no matter how good of a player you are or how good your numbers are. Not helping matters for either side though is the pathfinding. Holy jeez, the pathfinding in this game is surprisingly bad, and it's not going to seem like it at first, because so long as you're only telling 1 or 2 units to go to a specific spot, they can generally figure it out. However, there's clearly some weirdness going on with it, and while I couldn't narrow down the exact deficiencies, I was able to figure out a few generalizations as to what's going wrong with it. For starters, if you try to tell multiple units to path towards a narrow spot, you're only going to reliably get as many through as the width of that spot. So for instance, if you have a bridge that's 3 tiles wide and want to path a full group of 4 across it, chances are 3 will make it across and 1 will just start meandering around until the other 3 are across, and then will find a way to also get across. It's almost like the pathfinding itself blocks the pathfinding process. However, this becomes a much more serious issue when it comes to your peasants and peons trying to harvest gold from gold mines, if they have to go across a narrow path to do so, because peasants and peons, which can't pathfind to where they want to go, but have forests in their way, will instead decide to harvest lumber and then continue to harvest lumber forever until you stop them. More than once, I would be deep into a mission and look up at my gold count and wonder why I'm not getting any gold, only to notice I have way more lumber than I was expecting to have, and yeah, it's because most or all of my peasants or peons got their pathfinding messed up near forests and decided to just start chopping trees. Worse still though, if a unit runs into a pathfinding issue, even in the heat of battle, they stop dead in their tracks for a full second or more as they try to decide on a new path. For instance, if you have a group of 3 melee attackers in an L shape and want to attack a nearby enemy unit, instead of swarming around the enemy unit, your units will simply move up next to the enemy in the formation they were already in. Then after a moment, any which aren't attacking the enemy will finally swing into a better position to start attacking. And again, the enemy AI pathfinds all of their units without issue because it's constantly retraining each one into exact positions instead of trying to manipulate tiny groups. Yet the pathfinding is the single biggest deficiency in the original Warcraft, which, combined with the lack of unit grouping and only being able to select up to 4 units at a time, really makes it hard to play this game with offensive tactics, instead making defensive tactics much more effective overall. At least until the freaking catapults showed up. I know it seems a bit early to draw things to a close, but remember, I'm not really that good at strategy games, and Warcraft here is no exception. Thus, it's difficult for me to really dive super deep into its content and assess its strategic elements. But I can at least identify how the game works, how it doesn't, and comment on its aesthetic qualities. And given when this game came out, there weren't really a lot of good options for RTS games, as the genre was still pretty new at that point in time. So from that perspective, Warcraft wasn't a bad game, and was definitely helping to chart new territory while being very well polished in terms of its presentation. But geez, has it not aged well in terms of its raw mechanics. I mean, cripes, the version you get on GOG, which is the one I have, is an earlier version where you can't even click and drag the mouse to select multiple units, unless you're also holding down the control key. I mean, really, why was it so hard to just have click and drag without also having to hold down an extra keyboard key at the same time? Not long following though, we got Command & Conquer, which blew the doors of the RTS genre wide open. And as such, when Warcraft II was made, it expanded upon and enhanced the original Warcraft experience tremendously. So when it comes down to it, if you want to play a retro Warcraft game, the second one is by far the better option compared to the first, and thus I'd only really recommend the first one to fans of the series or the RTS genre as a whole who want to experience how the Warcraft franchise got its start. For everyone else, play the second one instead. Funnily enough, if you leave cycles set to auto or max, the game runs almost perfectly fine. But the one aspect which goes way too fast is the screen scrolling, even if you turn the scroll speed all the way down. Thus, you need to set a fixed cycles count in DOSBox. I recommend a setting of 30,000, which surprisingly is the same setting used by default in the GOG release. So hey, they actually got that one right. My experience so far has been that they usually don't. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on March 2nd will be another review, episode 324. And instead of covering a well-known game that most people will have heard of, we're going to be taking a look at a really old golf game that I played as a kid, which I'm going to guess has been long forgotten by most people. In fact, I don't think anyone even knows who the author of the game is. Well, I'll try to find out, and either way, make sure to stay tuned to see just how basic a golf game can get. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. If you'd also like to support the show directly and get some extra perks, then head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.